I think we're all here, so I'm going to get started. This is the big kahuna. This is where I'm going to wrap it all up. So let me go all the way back and start at the beginning and give you a systematic view of what Hume is doing. Hume starts very, very simply in the opening pages of the treatise. Impressions and ideas. Simple impressions, simple ideas. Complex impressions, complex ideas. Every simple idea is a copy of a preceding simple impression. Complex ideas may be copies of preceding complex impressions, but they may not be. Complex ideas may be put together by our mind from simple ideas that we have derived from previous simple impressions. So you form the image of Jabba the Hutt, say, or Jar Jar Binks, or a centaur, putting together complex, simple ideas in different ways that you never experienced as complex impressions. That's part one. Then you get impressions of sensation, impressions of reflection. I've gone through all of that. But those are the elements. Then in part three, Hume introduces something very important and different. It turns out the mind is not a tabula rasa, as Locke had said. It's not a blank slate on which experience writes. The mind brings to experience certain powers or dispositions or propensities or customs or habits, as Hume variously calls them, which it does not derive from experience, but which it brings to experience. Now, the first habit or capacity that the mind brings to experience is the ability to make copies of its impressions. Hume doesn't notice that, but the mind actually has the power to make copies of impressions and thereby to form ideas. Without that power, all it would have would be impressions. But it does have this power. But that power gives us ideas and impressions. Then Hume says, there is, however, a capacity of the mind, a tendency of the mind that takes us beyond what experience gives us. And that, of course, is causal inference. Now, the mind brings to experience the capacity to form certain habits. And here I want to draw a structural distinction that Hume isn't careful about, but which we need in order to make sense out of what's happening. And that is a difference between, I'll call it a difference between dispositions and habits, or Hume uses various languages. The mind has a general disposition to form certain kinds of habits. And the habit that he talks about in part three is the habit of observing similar impressions combined again and again. There's a constant conjunction of resembling impressions, which builds up in us a habit of expecting the second when we see the first. You see fire, you feel heat. You see fire, you feel heat. You see fire, you feel heat. Then you see fire, you develop a habit of expectation. You see fire, you don't feel the heat because you're too far from the fireplace, but your mind forms the idea of the heat because fire and heat have previously been constantly conjoined in your experience. And the mind not only forms the idea of the heat, but enlivens it because of the habit, thereby making it a belief that there is heat. And on top of that, Hume tells us later on in part three, the mind actually reflects upon this habit that it has and forms the idea of necessary connection, the idea that the flame is necessarily connected with the heat, that it causes the heat. Now, this habit of expectation and the impression, he says, of necessity, which is actually the idea of the habit, is not something that is given to us by experience. It's something we bring to experience. Now, Hume doesn't draw this distinction, but it's an important one. We have a general disposition to form habits of a certain sort, namely the sort that give us causal connection. What particular habits we form is a function of what our experience is. If I live in a hot climate and I never see snow, I do not form an association of snow with cold because I've never seen snow. The first time I see snow, I don't think cold because I've never seen snow before. If I live in a cold climate and have never seen a hot broiling sun, I don't form the idea of a hot broiling sun, and therefore I don't form causal associations. So what particular causal habits I form is a function of what experience I have, what impressions I get. But the general tendency to form these habits is something that I bring to experience, and I'm calling it a disposition. Hume sometimes calls it a propensity. Let's call it a disposition. So with this disposition, Hume says, without much discussion or examination, is universal among human beings. It never occurs to him to ask why every human being has this habit. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries that people after Kant began to think about the possibility that the categories evolved over time and so forth. But for Hume, the fact that he has this habit and the people he knows have this habit is enough for him to conclude that everybody has this disposition. I mean, and this is something we bring to experience, not something we derive from experience. There is no way from examining the contents of our experience, the impressions and ideas, that we could possibly conclude or deduce or even guess that we would have such a disposition. But we do have it, and it's that disposition that generates in us this belief in causal connection. That is the conclusion of part 3. Now in part 4, things get very much more complicated and interesting. And really, it's at this point that Hume really goes into things that even Kant, for example, so far as I can tell, never really thought through very carefully. Hume asks himself, where do we get the idea of objects that continue in existence independently of us, even when we are not perceiving them? We could not possibly get this idea from experience in the way that we get the idea of causal connection from experience. Since we never perceive objects when we are not perceiving them, that's a contradiction in terms, it is impossible for us to develop a habit of expecting objects to exist when we are not perceiving them. We perceive, let's take Hume's example of the fire in the hearth in his study. He sees the fire burning in the hearth. Then he looks away and he picks up a book, or he picks up a cup of tea, perhaps. I don't know what he drank. He gets up, he walks around, he comes back and he sees another image of the fire. Now this is a different impression of the fire. Let us suppose for the moment, although it's a flickering fire, that it is sufficiently similar so that it resembles very closely the first impression. But it is separated by a long period of time, which makes it obvious that it's a new impression. And yet we think that in our absence, the fire continued to burn and continued to exist. That's a very strange belief, one that goes beyond anything that experience could possibly present to us. And Hume spends part 4 trying to figure out how it is that we come to these beliefs in the continued and independent existence of objects. And he starts very slowly. He says, let us suppose that I stare at something for a period of time that is unchanging. I have a series of images that perfectly resemble one another. I'm looking at a book or a wall or an apple, and it doesn't change, nothing happens to it. I just have one image after another. The images are different from one another. I know that because I can separate one image from another. I can separate them, I can distinguish them, and insofar as I can distinguish them, they are so far separable in the imagination, Hume says, that they are not logically connected. So even though they may be perfectly resembling, nevertheless, they are different images, different impressions. But he says, let's take the case, he says, in which they are perfectly resembling. So I have a series of perfectly resembling impressions. Now, Hume says, viewed from the point of view of a succession of impressions, they are different from one another. They are separate from one another. But viewed from the point of view of their resemblance, they are perfectly resembling, and therefore a series is just looks just the same as a single impression. This leads me to confuse these two and to suppose that what we have here is an object that exists over time, not changing, but exists over a period of time. Now, it is clear that I can distinguish the earlier time of this non-changing object from the later time. I can do that in my imagination. I can do it if I want to Photoshop it. I can do it using modern technology in all manner of ways. So that makes it clear that it is not a single impression. But I confuse that with a single impression because the experience of the sequence of impressions is so similar to the experience of a single impression. The two experiences resemble each other so much that I confuse them together, even though, logically speaking, they are completely distinct. And Hume says here, let me just see if I can find the passage which I've typed out. He says, well, I'll come to it later. I don't want to stop the exposition because this is important. Now, once I have formed the idea of an object that continues to exist over time as I observe it, an idea for which there is no logical justification, you understand. Indeed, my idea of it is, strictly speaking, a contradiction, because I impute identity to what is a sequence of different impressions. And since they are different, they are not identical with one another. They just totally resemble one another. Now, however, let us suppose that as I am observing this object, and Hume uses object and impression interchangeably, remember, he's a direct realist, a fact which you have to remember in order to make sense of what he's saying. Suppose that the object changes. Suppose that as I watch the fire, it flickers and it dies down. It changes as I watch it. Well, because the sequence of impressions changes only a little bit, it resembles the sequence of perfectly resembling impressions. And so I associate those two together and I confuse one with the other. And I impute to the changing sequence of impressions the identity that I have imputed to the sequence of perfectly resembling impressions. And so I think that it is the same flame, the same fire, the same object, even though if it's an apple, I pick it up and I move it from one place to another. It's now in different places, but although it's in different places, my impressions of it, the sequence of impressions very much resembles the sequence of impressions of the apple held perfectly still, so that the impressions perfectly resemble one another. So I confuse these two, and I form the idea of an object that exists and changes over time. But then I go beyond even that. Hume says, he gives again, if you've read the treatise, you remember the example of getting up and leaving his study and coming back and finding ashes instead of a fire. Now, he has in the past observed a fire that burned all the way down to ashes. And that sequence of impressions is so similar to the sequence of impressions of a perfectly resembling fire that I confuse the two, and I think it's the same fire, even though now it has burned down until it's almost ashes. Now I do something which is quite astonishing. The mind, in effect, has a choice. Either it can view its experience as chaotic, as a buzzing, blooming confusion, as William James called it, or I can introduce order into my experience by supposing that the objects that I have formed a concept of continue to exist when I am not perceiving them. There's no possible way in which my experience could show me objects that exist when I don't perceive them, because that's a contradiction in terms. I can't see objects when I'm not perceiving them. I can't sense them when I'm not sensing them. But I posit the existence of these objects and suppose that they continue to exist independently of me. And I form the idea of independently existing objects. Now, Hume, God bless him, likes to contrast the views of philosophers with those of the people he calls the vulgar. I prefer to think in terms of what little babies learn, because I've had little babies as a father. I mentioned last time the experience that you have when you have a little baby. Before the baby can even talk or has any coherent, if Freud is correct, any coherent sense of itself as an organized entity, but you hold a rattle up in front of the baby and you shake it and the baby responds to it. Then you take it away and the baby stops responding. Then you hold it up again and the baby laughs and responds, and you take it away and the baby doesn't respond. After a while, the baby develops all by itself the notion that the object exists when it is not seeing it. This is not something that could possibly have derived from experience. It's something that brings to experience. And so now the baby makes motions and sounds indicating it wants the rattle to reappear, because it thinks that the rattle exists even though it is not in its visual realm. So I bring it out and the baby laughs again and giggles and gurgles. Now I go even further. I take it away and I hide it behind my back. And when I bring it out the next time, I bring it with a different hand. And the baby over time develops the idea that the object not only continues to exist when it is not being perceived, but has a life of its own when it is not being perceived. It changes, it goes places, it moves around, it might even change. Now, you can go beyond this. For the next example, I choose my grandchildren. My oldest son, Patrick, lives in San Francisco with his wife and his two children, my grandchildren, Samuel and Athena. Because they live in San Francisco, I don't see them very often. Well, just before the coronavirus hit, the whole family made a trip to North Carolina to visit me. Samuel is now 14 and he's just gone through an enormous growth spurt. He's a foot taller than he was the last time I saw him. Now, there are two possible interpretations I can give to my sense experience. One is to say, oh, my son and his wife, Diana, got rid of their old kids and got two new kids. That is a perfectly rational conclusion, because the new kids look very different from the old kids. The alternative view, which introduces more coherence into my world, is to suppose that the children have changed while I haven't been around them, and that Athena has become a tweenie, and Samuel is now taller than his father, who is taller than I am. The mind brings to its experience a set of dispositions to introduce more coherence into its world than that world can possibly present to us. And by doing so, it fleshes that world out with objects which go on changing when we are not experiencing them. When I am not perceiving them, those objects change. When they reappear, then I come to the conclusion that not that they are new objects, but that the objects have changed while I was not watching them. Now, the crucial thing that I'm hammering away at is that although Hume starts with this very elementary structure of impressions and ideas and thinks that he's going to limit himself to them, very quickly he moves far beyond that and introduces a theory of the structure of the mind as an active participant in experience. The mind coming to experience with dispositions to form various beliefs and to flesh out its experience in ways that experience cannot possibly on its own justify. What Hume thinks that the mind brings to experience is functionally almost identical with Kant's theory of the categories in the Critique of Pure Reason. Now, you have to not be misled by the difference between the rather ponderous Germanic Latinate terminology of Kant and the "ah shucks, no nonsense, it's just us folks here" talk of Hume, who talks about a gentle force of association and a habit and so forth. That's a difference in style, but it's not a difference in the logical structure of the argument. thus far what we're getting is Hume's theory of the categories. The categories, I'll just point out to you, this you can see in my lectures, which I've posted on the Critique of Pure Reason. The categories are second order rules. They are rules for the construction of empirical concepts. They are dispositions for the formation of habits. They have the same logical relationship to empirical concepts that Hume's dispositions have to our empirical beliefs. And the mind comes to experience with this set of dispositions that it brings to experience, and from which it takes the rather chaotic materials of ideas and impressions which come to us in a jumbled way, and builds out of those first a set of habits of expectation which give us causation, and then beyond that, not later but independently, a structure of beliefs in the continued and independent existence of objects, which gives us a world of objects engaged in causal interactions when we are not experiencing them. Now, this is not something that any possible evidence can justify. The interesting thing is, after Hume has given his explanation of causal inference, he sort of takes it as now justified. Even though it's not logically justified, it is adequately defended. It is part of what he calls natural belief. And so he makes a great deal of pointing out that even if you grant causal inference as something that has in some way been explained and defended in part 3, that is not enough to give us the structure of independently and continually existing objects that he needs in part 4 in order to flesh out the world, because the belief in objects takes us beyond anything that we could possibly learn from causal inference. Causal inference just tells us that if we've experienced A and we've experienced B over and over and over again, then when we experience A, we expect B, even though B isn't present. And that's the causal inference. That takes us beyond the scope of our experience, but it is based upon past associations. The belief in the continued and independent existence of objects cannot possibly be based on that kind of past experience, because we never experience objects when we are not experiencing them. That's a contradiction in terms. So the mind must actually introduce totally into its otherwise chaotic experience a structure of objects in independent existence that no possible causal inference could justify. Now, let me just read you some passages to sort of give you an idea of how Hume talks about this. I do this in part because I love reading Hume, since he writes so beautifully. He starts off in section 1 by brushing aside all the arguments for total skepticism. He says, nature by an absolute and uncontrollable necessity has determined us to judge as well as to breathe and feel, nor can we any more forbear viewing certain objects in a stronger and fuller light upon account of their customary connection with a present impression than we can hinder ourselves from thinking as long as we are awake, or seeing the surrounding bodies when we turn our eyes toward them in broad sunshine. Whoever has taken the pains to refute the cavils of this total skepticism has really disputed without an antagonist, and endeavored by arguments to establish a faculty which nature has antecedently implanted in the mind and rendered unavoidable. Then when he comes to section 2, where he talks about continued and independent existence, I'll just give you his language of the examples that he gives. I never have observed, what happens is he hears a knock on the door. His room is apparently on the 2nd floor, judging from his description of it. He hears a knock on the door, and a porter comes in with the mail or something like that. And Hume says, I have never observed that this noise could proceed from anything but the motion of a door, and therefore conclude that the present phenomenon is a contradiction to all past experience, unless the door which I remember on the other side of the chamber be still in being. The point is, he doesn't see the door, so he has a choice. He can either decide that his experience is chaotic, that sometimes there are knocks without doors and sometimes there are knocks with doors, or he can suppose that the door continues to exist even though he doesn't see it. And the mind, as he puts it, the mind tends to run in the direction of making its experience more orderly by presuming the existence of an object that he does not perceive, namely the door, and also the porter, and also the stairs that the porter climbed to get to the second floor, and so forth. So he says, "'Twill readily be allowed that since nothing is ever really present to the mind beside its own perceptions, it is not only impossible that any habit should ever be acquired otherwise than by the regular succession of these perceptions, but also that any habit should ever exceed that degree of regularity. Any degree, therefore, of regularity in our perceptions can never be a foundation for us to infer a greater degree of regularity in some objects which are not perceived, since this supposes a contradiction, viz. A habit acquired by what was never present to the mind. But 'tis evident that whenever we infer the continued existence of the objects of sense from their coherence and the frequency of their union, it is in order to bestow on the objects a greater regularity than what is observed in our mere perceptions." So what he's saying, you see, is that even causal inference is not adequate to yield our belief in the continued and independent existence of objects. That has to be a separate disposition that the mind brings to experience, separate from the disposition to form habits of causal inference. And in that, there is a whole structure of such dispositions that the mind brings to experience. They are, as I keep saying, just like Kant's categories, only not so fancy. He says, the imagination, when set into any train of thinking, is apt to continue even when its object fails it, and like a galley put in motion by the oars, carries on in its course without any new impulse. Objects have a certain coherence even as they appear to our senses, but this coherence is much greater and more uniform if we suppose the object to have a continued existence, and as the mind is once in the train of observing an uniformity among objects, it naturally continues till it renders the uniformity as complete as possible. The simple supposition of their continued existence suffices for this purpose and gives us a notion of a much greater regularity among objects than what they have when we look no further than our senses. So, what Hume is saying is that we have a natural tendency to introduce more coherence and order into our experience than experience presents. And that coherence and order is a large part of the totality of the order of the natural world that in our vulgar phases we simply suppose we observe, but which upon examination we realize we could never observe. The mind, in short, in the passage that I quoted to you last week from Kant, the mind is the lawgiver to nature, not just with regard to causation, but with regard to the total order of nature, including the continued and independent existence of objects. Now, this raises, obviously, a question. The question is, what is the mind that has this structure? What is this structure, and how does the mind do this? And Hume now does something which just blows me away. And it's the first time I encountered it, it astonished me. In section 6 of part 4, the other sections are not very interesting. In section 6, which is called Of Personal Identity, Hume goes on to consider the nature of the mind that is doing all of this transforming. And now, when Hume comes to discuss the nature of the mind, he completely undercuts everything he has done and leaves us absolutely adrift. And he does something quite astonishing. He says, For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. If anyone upon serious and unprejudiced reflection thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can no longer reason with him. But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, this is this famous passage, and it just blows me away. Setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. And then he says, as if to nail down the refutation of everything that he has thus said, the mind is a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity in different. Whatever natural propensions we may have to imagine that simplicity and identity. The comparison of the theater must not mislead us, says Hume. They are the successive perceptions only that constitute the mind. There is no theater, nor have we the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented, or of the materials of which it is composed. In short, having gone through this elaborate description of the dispositions of the mind to form habits that flesh out our world, connect objects in causal connections, create a world of objects which exists even when we don't perceive them, Hume now says there is no mind. There are just the perceptions. The mind is like a theater where like actors come and go on the stage uttering different lines. The ideas come and go in an endless flux, but there is no theater. That the image of the theater must not mislead us. And at that point, I threw up my hands. What is he doing? He has just undermined the theory that he has laid out. And he really does. Now, in the last chapter, Hume issues a charming disclaimer. And I have to read it because it is Hume at his very best. He says, after he's gone through all of this deliberation, the intense view of these manifold contradictions and imperfections in human reason has so wrought upon me and heated my brain that I am ready to reject all belief and reasoning and can look upon no opinion even as more probable or likely than another. Where am I or what? From what causes do I derive my existence, and to what condition shall I return? Whose favor shall I court, and whose anger must I dread? What beings surround me, and on whom have I any influence, or have any influence on me? I am confounded with all these questions, and begin to fancy myself in the most deplorable condition imaginable, environed with the deepest darkness, and utterly deprived of the use of every member and faculty. The philosophical gloom. And then he says, most fortunately it happens that since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind or by some avocation and lively impression of my senses, which obliterate all these chimeras. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse and am merry with my friends, and when after 3 or 4 hours amusement I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any further. And then a few pages later he says, in a wonderful tagline for the whole book, generally speaking, the errors in religion are dangerous. Those in philosophy are only ridiculous. And that's where he leaves us. Then he goes on to books 2 and 3, which are much less interesting. Look at what Hume has done here. Without even quite acknowledging it, realizing it, yes, but not acknowledging it. He has started with nothing but impressions and ideas, and then he has brought to this a theory of the operations of the human mind, which takes these elements and transforms them into a causally connected world of independently existing and continuing objects, the world as we know it. And the mind does this, as he says, it's the vulgar who do this, not philosophers, or as I say, it's babies who do this before even they can speak. By the time they're old enough to speak, babies have a rather coherent idea of the world around them and the people around them, of objects, of their own bodies, of their rattles and their playthings, of their brothers and sisters, of their parents, of the bottle they get, and so forth. And they have all of this without the benefit of either David Hume or Immanuel Kant. This is the natural way in which the human mind functions. Now, Hume didn't do this, but we can, reconstructing things from what Hume has said. We could, if we wanted to, create a table of categories. Now, if you know Kant's philosophy at all, you know that the table of categories has 4 sets of 3 categories. And Kant does this because he's a maniac for system. But most of those 12 categories don't really count for very much. The important ones are causation and a few others, cause and effect and a few others. In the same way, we could construct a system if we would had that frame of mind, if we were Germans instead of Englishmen, in effect. If he were German instead of English, Hume could construct a table of 4 sets of 3 dispositions to form habits of certain sorts. And that would make it seem very impressive. There is, however, now, this makes it sound as though there's no difference between Hume and Kant. And there's an enormous difference between Hume and Kant. What is the difference? Well, I think I mentioned this in an earlier lecture in a throwaway sentence. The difference is the transcendental unity of apperception. That is to say, Kant recognizes something that Hume did not recognize. And that gives Kant the basis on which to construct an argument to demonstrate the necessity, the absolute necessity for this set of dispositions and habits, this system of categories, which in Hume can merely be simply a description of what he finds when he thinks about how we go about organizing our experience. And what this has to do with is precisely the unity of the self. The self, the fact that everything I say or think is something that can be preceded with the phrase, I think that, I think. The I think can, as Kant says, the I think can attach to all my representations. As Hume would put it, the I think attaches to all my impressions and ideas because they are my impressions and ideas. I have these impressions, I have these ideas. You could imagine Hume and Kant engaged in a debate. I spent a lot of time in my life imagining this debate in which they confront one another. And Hume presents his skeptical arguments and he presents his elaborate story about the way in which the mind works. And Kant says, but will you not grant that everything that you say involves the I think? That everything you say can be preceded with the proposition, I think that such and such. I experience such and such. I have this impression. I have this idea. And Hume says, yeah, so what? And Kant says, but that means that all of these thoughts are contained in your mind, in a single mind. And now Kant, using a device which was invented by Brentano and taken over by William James and then taken over by other people reading William James, uses a device to show what this involves. I'll just, since I have time, I will just tell you what it is. James says, I'll tell you a funny story about this when I get done. James says, take a sentence of 12 words and take 12 people and tell each person one of those 12 words. If you bunch those 12 people as close together as possible, nowhere in that bunch will be a cognition of the sentence itself, of the sentence as a unified sentence. All there will be is a thought. Now, the first time I taught this 59 years ago, no, 60 years ago, the first time I taught this, I chose a sentence from James Thurber's lovely one-page story, There's a Unicorn in the Garden. You can look it up if you haven't read it. If you don't know who James Thurber is, then you can look him up. But anyway, it's a comic story about a man who says to his wife, there's a unicorn in the garden. There is a unicorn in the garden is 7 words. So I called up 8 students from my class. To 7 of them, I handed 7 pieces of paper, on one of which there was written the word the unicorn. There is a unicorn in the garden. Seven pieces of paper, one with each word. I told them to stand on one side of the room. Then I handed to the 8th student a piece of paper on which was printed the sentence, there is a unicorn in the garden. Now I asked them to think about, I told everybody what I was doing, and I asked all 8 students to think very hard on what they found on their piece of paper. And I pointed out that although on one side there was a consciousness of each of the words, there was no consciousness of the sentence. On the other side of the room, there was a consciousness of the sentence, the student who had the paper with the whole sentence on it. That's the difference between mere association of ideas and unity of consciousness. And then from that, Kant develops the whole theory of synthesis, reproduction, and imagination according to a rule, which allows him then to give a demonstration of the logical validity of the causal maxim and all the other things he needs. Whereas Hume doesn't have that. Hume says, since the mind is nothing but a heap or bundle of perceptions, if one of the perceptions is separated from the mind and goes elsewhere, as it were, that's perfectly possible. You could divide somebody's mind in half, and half of the ideas and impressions would be in one bundle, and half the ideas and impressions would be in another bundle. Since they are distinguishable, they are separable. Since they're separable, they can, at least in imagination, be separated, as Hume says in part 3. Hume doesn't have the idea of the unity of consciousness. This unity of consciousness is, for Kant, and would be had he thought about it for Hume, the 18th century realization of the real meaning of the 17th century proposition that uttered by Descartes, cogito, I think. That is the correct reinterpretation of Descartes' cogito. And what Hume and Kant both do, but Kant brings it to conclusion, is to go back to the cogito and rethink it and understand what the real implications of it are. Hume, coming out of the British empiricist tradition, does not make those moves. In fact, as I say, much to my astonishment and distress, having developed a whole theory of the structures of the mind that the mind brings to, the activities that the mind brings to its experience, then in section 6 of part 4, he says there is no mind. There is just the theater in which the ideas and impressions come and go like actors, but there is no theater, there is just the flow of impressions and ideas. But that can't be right, because he's just finished spending part 3 and part 4 talking about all the things that the mind brings to experience, the habits, the dispositions to form habits of various sorts, not just the habit of association that gives rise to causal connection, but the much more complex and adventuresome habits, as it were, that give rise to the notion of a world of independently existing objects. All of that is what sort of flashed through my mind 69, 67 years ago when I took my senior honors generals in philosophy at Harvard, and which led to my article on Hume's theory of my dissertation on the theory of mental activity and the treatise of human nature and the critique of pure reason, then to my article 3 years later on Hume's theory of mental activity, and then my first book, Kant's theory of mental activity. I've been away from Hume for a long time, but it's been rather fun to come back to him and to recreate this recognition that I had all those years ago of what's really going on in the treatise. The treatise is, understood in this way, an enormously powerful philosophical work, much more powerful than the Enquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, which Hume published some years later. And it is, I think, for this reason, the greatest work of philosophy ever written in English. Now, with that, I've come to the conclusion of my story. And if you will unmute yourself, I'd be delighted to take questions and discussion and talk about this or anything else. So just anybody? We were all stunned or bored into silence. Yes, I hear somebody unmuting.
Right. Hi. I have a question. So, going back to Hume's analysis of causal inference,
Yeah,
um, I I have an impression of the fire, and by habit, I have the idea of heat.
yes.
I guess which yeah. Now,
But only after I've had, on many occasions, the impression of fire and the
right
impression of heat, which
now this
creates an association. Then I, I, I see the fire and I feel the heat. I see the fire and I feel the heat. I see
yeah.
the fire and I feel the heat. I develop a habit of association.
Now
Then
in each of
go ahead,
sorry
go ahead.
in each of these instances, building up to this habit, I have a particular impression of the fire and a particular impression of the heat,
Yes,
or rather an impression of a particular fire and an impression of a particular heat.
yes.
But the idea of heat, which I then infer after this habit is established, is that could we say a general idea? That is, the causal regularity is between general ideas, right?
Okay,
And
yes,
secondly,
yes, you're
okay,
right. This goes back to something that we talked about. Perhaps I didn't talk about it enough earlier in the treatise. General ideas are particular ideas associated with a habit. That is,
right,
I don't have an idea of fire in general. I've ideas of particular fires, which are copies of
yeah,
impressions of particular fires. When I want to form the idea of fire in general, what I do is I take the idea of a particular fire, which is a copy of a particular impression, but the mind has a habit which enables it to call up, when it wants to, other examples of fire. And what's more, Hume says, I'm not sure I actually mentioned this, I should have. Not only does the mind have the ability to form this habit, but it has the remarkable ability to think of counter instances if I make a mistake. So, for example, he gives the example of triangles. Suppose I form I want to form the idea of triangle in general, but I can't form a general idea. I have to have an idea of a particular triangle. Let us suppose that the idea of a particular triangle that I have, which is itself, of course, the copy of an impression of a particular triangle, happens to be the idea of an isosceles triangle. So when I am thinking about triangles, I use the word triangle. I call up the idea of a copy of a particular isosceles
mm,
triangle, the impression of a particular isosceles triangle. And I am about to say, oh, I see, all triangles have two equal angles. And the mind says, no, think of this example, which is also a triangle. It's a scalene triangle. The mind, in other words, has the ability to think up counter instances to correct me from making mistaken conclusions from the particular characteristics of particular ideas which are associated with a general term. Now, this is a very powerful ability that Hume talks about and moves on fairly quickly, but it's obviously crucial. If we could have the idea in general of a triangle, which was not the copy of any particular impression of a triangle, then there would be ideas that were not copies of particular impressions, and he denies that. So his answer to that, his explanation is, it's every idea is the idea of a particular instance, a particular object, which is the copy of a particular impression. But connected to that is a rule or habit of association that enables me to associate all the other things which are gathered under that idea. So when I think of horses, I think of a particular horse. Suppose I think of a small horse. And I think, oh, yes, and I see a zebra. I think, oh, that's a horse. And my mind says, no, it's not a horse. Even though it's small, like the idea that you formed of horse, which is a copy of a particular impression, it does not fit the rules which are constitute the general idea. So therefore, it's not a horse, it's a zebra. Does that make
Okay.
any sense? You,
Uh, yeah.
you don't look persuaded.
Now, I'm wondering now, because I'm hung up on general ideas with Hume. So uh, I don't know if this is related. If I have the idea of an object X as persisting over time as independent, um, how 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 is its content different from the idea of X as not as persisting? Is it the case that, as with maybe in case of general ideas with causal inferences, that the general idea is conjoined with a habit, and that, so to speak, colors its content or almost becomes part of its content? Is that this? I mean, you can have the you have this idea of an object, a dog, as persisting over time, as opposed to, which would be crazy, I guess, having thinking each time you have an impression of a dog that it's different.
It's not
But
crazy. It makes perfectly
makes
good
sense,
sense.
yeah.
It
So,
just
but
isn't as organized. So the
it isn't
mind
as
rejects
organized,
it. Mind
right?
rejects it.
So the idea of the self-identical dog has no empirical content. Um,
It has empirical content, but has no empirical justification. It is a belief that goes beyond what
yeah,
experience could possibly justify. The most that
right.
experience could justify is that
Mm.
I see a dog here, I see a dog there, I see a dog there. The Remember, I took you fairly quickly through the sequence of stages that Hume says the mind goes through. The first thing it does is to observe an unchanging sequence of impressions over time. And it confuses that unchanging sequence of impressions with the experience of a single impression because they are so similar to one another. So then it gets from that the notion of the existence of the same thing over time, which is, if you think
Yeah,
about it, a contradiction in terms. It can't be
yeah,
the same thing because you could separate some of the impression, some of those perfectly resembling impressions from other perfectly resembling impressions. You could imagine, excuse me, I've just been gotten a pop-up on my computer. Now you can't see that pop-up when it happens on my
no,
computer. That's weird.
noisy.
It's taking me a while to understand how this thing
Okay.
actually works.
Yeah,
It's like my cell phone. I have only the
no.
vaguest notion how it works, but I rely on it. Okay, so that's step number one. Step number two is when there are breaks in the sequence of perfectly resembling impressions because I look away and look back and look away and look back. Now what I have is a sequence of perfectly resembling impressions with gaps. I fill in the gaps and associate that with the experience of the sequence of perfectly resembling impressions without gaps. And in order to make sense out of that, I posit the independent existence of these impressions when I am not perceiving them.
Yeah.
That's step number two.
I guess my question is, this idea or this notion of positing independent existence, is that something itself have? What kind of content does that have? You know?
It
The
is
idea of self-identity, what sort of idea is that? Uh,
it is fundamentally,
yeah,
Hume says, a confusion.
yeah,
The mind confuses two different, our whole experience of the world that we live in is founded on a set of very complex confusions and contradictions that the mind brings to its experience in order to make it more orderly than it really is,
Right.
make it appear to be more orderly than it really is, says Hume. The
It's
only,
just that, you know,
yeah, go ahead.
it's just that in the case of causal inference, we had habit take over,
Yes.
where conceptual clarity might fail. And now I'm wondering just how clear. I mean, I guess it sounded like a positivist. How clear the idea of self identity is.
It's not clear at all. It's
Yeah.
based on a confusion. I mean, and your,
Okay.
your, your, your sense is exactly right. It goes far beyond what the habit giving us causal inference yields.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it goes beyond it in a way that is absolutely contradictory to the experience. The mind creates out of its own internal resources a regularity, a regular world that it does never experience and could never experience.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
the thing
Yeah.
to do is to talk to your friends and play a game of backgammon and stop worrying about these things, says
Yeah.
Hume.
Yeah.
After, I mean, you
I'll
have to
try that.
remember, Hume actually suffered a mental breakdown almost, apparently,
Yeah,
when he
I
was a
can
young man
understand
thinking through this. But I mean,
that.
but I mean,
Yeah.
Kant didn't. Kant was tougher. He just propounded all these contradictory things and sat back and smiled. Had dinner with his friends in Königsberg who were traveling from Scotland as businessmen, which is how he found out about the world. But if you think about it, what Hume is saying is that the mind brings not merely, I mean, the simplest thing to understand is the habit that gives rise to the belief in causal connection. Much more complex is this set of dispositions that leads us to flesh the world out with continued and independently existing objects of a sort that we could never, in the nature of things, experience.